the government has said that changes may vary across different nations.
So let's hear how it might work in Northern Ireland, where firm plans are due to be announced next week. The First Minister of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster, joins us now. Thank you very much for your time this morning, Arlene Foster. Can you just establish, first of all, for us, what is your timeline in relation to any announcements to do with relaxing the restrictions?
Well, good morning. Just like the other nations of the United Kingdom, we have our own regulations, and we reviewed those regulations yesterday on the 3-week timeline, and we have decided to reimpose those regulations for another 3 weeks. And the reason behind that, of course, is all to do with this very famous R0 number that we're now very familiar with, in other words, the transmission of the virus. And we are told in Northern Ireland that our R0 number is around 0.8, 0.9. So we don't want to take any chances that that will go above the number 1 again, and the transmission of the virus will increase again. So that's why we've decided at this point in time to reimpose the regulations again. But at the same time, we do, of course, recognise that we have to give hope for the future and a plan for the future. So early next week, we will be publishing our roadmap as to what will happen in the coming weeks and months.
Just to be absolutely clear then, for a further 3 weeks, there will be no change to the way that you are advising people to behave, no changes in social distancing, no changes in the amount of daily exercise they can take. Everything will stay as it is.
Everything will stay as it is. We have a process, a risk analysis, if you like, that we use to look at all of these matters. And we don't just look at the public health. Of course, that's the priority. We do have to look at the economic damage that has been done to our country, and indeed the societal damage and the wider health issues, which we have to take into account as well. So during the next 3 weeks, we will continuously look at those risks, and we will look to see whether we can make minor amendments within those 3 weeks, and then at the end of those 3 weeks, what it is we can do to relax those regulations. But at the moment, we want to make sure that we don't see the virus becoming virulent again and coming over that number 1, that all-important number 1, because if it does that, then the virus will start to transmit again in the community.
So if I could remind you and people watching now about Boris Johnson's comments in the Commons, where he said, we'll want, if we possibly can, to get going with some of these measures, which is to do with the changes, on Monday. I think it'd be a good idea if people had an idea of what's coming the following day. That's why I think Sunday is the best time to do it. Do you see any discrepancy in what he's saying as to what you have just told us?
No, I don't. And we spoke with the Prime Minister yesterday, all of the devolved administrations, and he said to us that he was moving forward with maximum caution, and he recognised that for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, we have to review our own regulations. But at the same time, he and I as well want us to move forward, if we can, in a 4-nations way, because when we do that, we have simplicity of message, we have clarity of message, and people really understand what's going on when we all move together as a bloc. Of course, we do recognise that our naught number is different across the 4 nations. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it is at the upper end, whereas in London, we are told it is down about 0.5 at the moment. And that's simply because London had the virus before the rest of the country, and therefore we are now in a different place. And I think that when people talk about different regions moving at different times, that's perhaps what they're speaking about. But from my point of view, I think the simplicity and clarity of the message works best when we're all able to move at the same point in time.
So given what you've just said, and I know there is a great deal of caution around particularly how some of the newspapers interpreted what Boris Johnson said. They were talking about extending the time you could be out of doors, maybe changing restrictions on households. If it were to be the case that Boris Johnson announced for England that there were to be changes, maybe nuanced changes like those, you would stay with the restrictions that you have in Northern Ireland. Is that how that would work?
Well, I think there's a difference between sticking with the restrictions and making nuanced changes. And as I've said, we can make nuanced changes within those 3 week, within the 3 week period where we have the regulations in place again, we are by law, we have to look at those regulations every 3 weeks to make sure that they are proportionate and necessary for the protection of public health, and that's absolutely right. But during those 3 weeks, we can look to see if there are some nuanced changes that we can make, and I would put going out more for exercise in the open air as a nuanced change rather than a fundamental change. So I think that those things can be looked at during the 3 weeks. But what is important is that the regulations are in place for another 3 weeks because we believe they are needed to protect the health of citizens of Northern Ireland, and I think you will see that right across the United Kingdom.
Now, of course, you share a border with the Republic of Ireland, and we know already that from the 18th of May, they have said very clearly that they would reopen the country in a slow, phased way. There is a different timetable happening there, which relates to things like outdoor meetings between people, extending how far people are allowed to go from their home in their exercising, and possibly opening of schools in a certain timetable. Do you foresee any problems around those border areas where you may have people living very close to each other who are living under very different regimes?
Well, I don't think they will be very different regimes. I think what is important as well is that we continue to share information across the 2 jurisdictions on the island. We've been doing that very well. Our chief medical officers have a very close relationship and speak to each other so that we can understand how the disease is working in both jurisdictions. And the important thing is that we share information, and if there are slight differences, that we communicate those differences and are able to understand why they're in place. I think that's the important piece for our citizens, that there's a clarity of message and a simplicity of message, and I think that comes across best when we work as 4 nations within the UK and we communicate with our neighbours in the Republic of Ireland as well.
And just as a final thought, Arlene Foster, on that clarity of message issue, a lot of people are saying the message has not been clear. You listened to Nicola Sturgeon, you listened to Boris Johnson, we listened to you this morning, and there feels like there are discrepancies there. Are you concerned? And I appreciate that you have tried to be very clear with us about your own message, but do you appreciate that some people are thinking there have been messaging issues along the way?
Well, I think that we're at a critical point now where the disease is beginning to plateau, but what we don't want to see happening is that it comes back up again. And as it begins to plateau, of course, we will want to plan for the future. And of course, we want to give hope to people, because on this Victory in Europe Day, it's important that we achieve another victory in Europe and make sure that we defeat this virus. So what is important is that we give hope, but also say to people, stick with us, stick with the stay-at-home message if you can. Go to work and practice safe working practices if you need to go to work. But it is important, very important, that we look to the future as well, for the sake of our economy and for the sake, frankly, of the health of our people moving into the future as well.
Arlene Foster, thank you for your time this morning. Arlene Foster, of course,
you.
First Minister of Northern Ireland.